class, we're going to start this lesson on the video, and then during class time you are going to be doing activities with your substitute, and your job is to watch the video, fill out the notes, and come to class prepared, ready to complete the assignments about the topic of this video. This first video is about the smallest organisms in our universe, or in our world right now. Bacteria and viruses. So get your notes out, a pen or pencil, and follow along as we go through these three sections of a few chapters. Think about if you were a farmer and all of a sudden your plants, your crops, were starting to die of a disease, but you really didn't know what was causing it. Was it something alive? Was it something in the environment? What was it that was killing your crops? Well, this is what was happening in the 1800s in different countries. A man by the name of Dmitry Ivanovsky, he was a Russian scientist and was studying a tobacco plant that was having some deadly disease that was destroying it. And as he was studying this disease, he demonstrated that the cause of this deadly disease was found in liquid that was extracted from the infected plants. So he knew that was something inside the plants that was causing this disease. Well, a few years later, in 1897, another man, a Dutch scientist named Martinez, he was suggesting that inside this juice, this liquid from the plants, was the disease, and he called it a virus, which was the Latin name for poison. And that's where we get now our virus, in English, our virus name, because it was some sort of poison killing these plants. And then later, an American scientist in 1935, Wendell Stanley, he found crystals in this liquid, and he knew that living organisms don't form crystals. So he was thinking, okay, we have the deadly virus, the deadly disease inside the liquid. This liquid is crystallizing, so whatever it is that's killing these plants is not alive. It's not a living thing that we know of. And so then we knew that these viruses, these small, tiny organisms, were not alive. So now we have a working definition of a virus. A virus is a non-living particle that's made of proteins, nucleic acids, and sometimes it has some lipids in there. The only way that these viruses can produce is by infecting other living organisms. We've already talked a little bit about bacteriophages, which I hope you guys remember are viruses that infect bacteria. And these viruses, there are many different types of viruses. Bacteriophages are only one type, and they come in many different shapes and sizes. They can be, they're only sometimes seen with very powerful electron microscopes. They're very, very small. Smaller, oftentimes, than our cells. The outside of the virus, as you guys remember hopefully from the previous chapter on DNA, the outside of the virus is made of a protein coat, and we call that the capsid. It's a vocabulary word, just to kind of get you familiar with some of the working vocabulary in this talking about viruses. And sometimes viruses, like the influenza or the flu virus, have more membranes surrounding them. The simplest virus that we know only has a few genes, but the most complex has more than 100 different types of genes that give it different traits. We did say that most viruses have proteins on their surface, and these proteins that are surrounding the virus, they help to bind it to a new host cell. This protein tricks the cell into thinking, oh, it's just new material that we need to incorporate into our cell. And once that virus, that genetic material is inside the cell, then it starts to destroy it. Most viruses only infect a specific type of cell. So if you have a plant virus, it's only going to infect plants, and animal viruses only infect animals. And then viruses that infect bacteria are called bacteriophages. So we all know, hopefully, that the common cold is a virus. So how does this work? How does it get into our bodies and cause us to have all those symptoms of being sick? They attack with a very simple and fast infection. At first, that capsid, the outside of the virus, that protein, attaches to our cells, and most of the time it comes in through our noses, and it starts to get into our cells. It's on top of our cells, and once the cell lets that genetic material in, it starts making copies of this infectious genetic material that causes us to have runny noses, feel upset in our stomach, have a fever. All of these are the side effects of this virus. The host cell, our cells, they mistake this information for its own. This information is allowed to replicate, duplicate, and once it does that, after it makes all these copies of its own information, the virus information, it's released from our cells and goes and infects many, many other cells. That's why we get sick so fast sometimes, and it just spreads throughout our body because it made so many copies of its genetic information telling our bodies to have these different responses. And sometimes within 8 hours, our cells release all of this viral information into our bodies. And it goes on, infects other cells, and the same process happens over and over again. And so many of our cells will have this viral information. Therefore, we call these viruses a parasite because it's not helping us, it's hurting us. And they depend totally on the host, on us, in the case of the cold. And many times it does harm the organism. The virus must infect living things in order to grow and reproduce and take advantage of all the nutrients that the host has to offer. So how are viruses and cells similar and different? Viruses have many characteristics of our living things. They can reproduce, regulate their gene expression, and evolve or change and adapt to their environment. However, that only happens within another host cell. They cannot do this on their own. Therefore, they are not alive. And you have a table in your book in chapter 20, section 1, that talks about the different characteristics of viruses and cells and how they're similar and different. So this one part is just about viruses. They're not alive, they're very small, and they are parasites. They infect the host, and that's the only way that they can survive. Next, we're going to talk about bacteria and prokaryotes. We've already talked a little bit about prokaryotes, but now we're going to continue and move on to chapter 20, section 2, prokaryotes. In this section, think about if you were always living in your home and you thought no one else was around you. You were the only one alive, you're the only one there, you didn't know anyone else existed. Until one day when you walked outside, all of a sudden you saw there were people and your eyes were open to this whole world that was around you the whole time. This is kind of what what happened to scientists when we had the discovery of the microscope. When we had this microscope, all of a sudden we could see these small, tiny particles, these little organisms that were all around us that we could never see before. So in the past few 100 years, we've been able to get a lot more information about our world and all the organisms that are living in it. So what are prokaryotes? Remember, they do not have a nucleus. All of their genetic material is out in the cytoplasm. And for an example you have is the E. coli bacteria. It's one of the most simplistic, complete examples of a bacteria. Recently, biologists have divided prokaryotes into two very different groups, bacteria and archaea. We've already talked a little bit about this, so this will hopefully be a review. Bacteria is the bigger of the two groups, and they live almost everywhere, in freshwater, saltwater, land, on the bodies of humans and other eukaryotes. And the E. coli bacteria that you see in your picture is in our intestines. It's something that lives inside of us normally, and if it stays where it's supposed to, it doesn't normally hurt us. Bacteria normally have a special cell wall that helps protect them and gives them their shape. This cell wall contains peptoglycan and is again very strong. Some bacteria even have a second membrane or wall around that one, and again gives them much more protection and resistance to damage. How do bacteria move? Some of them move with a little tail called a flagella, and others have pili, which allow them to attach themselves. They're little fibers, little hairs that allow them to attach themselves to other bacteria. The second group, Archaea, is very similar if you look under the microscope to the regular bacteria. They don't have a nuclei, they're very small, they have cell walls, but their cell wall does not contain that peptoglycan like the one in the regular bacteria. Many of these Archaea like to live in very harsh environments, very salty, very hot environments. And you'll have a picture of the Utah Great Salt Lakes. And again, temperatures are boiling, and these bacteria actually give the water its color that you can see there, the yellows, the oranges. Those are because of the bacteria, the Archaea. Now these bacteria range from different sizes. Small, 1 micrometer, to a little bit larger, 5 micrometers, but they're still much smaller than eukaryotic cells. There are 3 main shapes of these bacteria that we're going to talk about today and that you're going to look for in the lab. The first is the rod-shaped prokaryotes that look like little rods or ovals, sometimes look like little pills, and those are called bacilli. You also have round bacteria that's called cocci. It's spherical and round. And the third one is little spirals called spirilla. Also corkscrew shaped. So these 3, I'm not going to expect you to remember the technical names, bacilli, cocci, and spirilla, but just so that you know in case it comes up as you continue in science. But we have rods, spheres, and squiggly lines. We can also distinguish different bacteria on how they move. Again, some have little tails called flagella. Some glide through their material, their medium, kind of slimy because they secrete this slimy material. And they also have to grow and replicate and duplicate. When they grow to a certain size, almost nearly double, they need to divide. And so their DNA divides and produces 2 identical cells. This is called binary fission or asexual reproduction. And it allows them to reproduce at a very fast rate because they're just making identical copies. And with certain conditions, these bacteria can even just reproduce as often as once every 20 minutes. Which, if you think about it, that's really fast for bacteria to be growing. And again, that's why different sicknesses can spread so quickly because these bacteria grow so fast. What are some uses or some ways that bacteria live in our world? First of all, they are decomposers. Many of them take the molecules from the earth, the soil, they break them down into simpler molecules that can be reused again by other organisms. They help to keep all of those raw materials, those nutrients in our soil, in the air, in the water, that let our world keep on cycling those nutrients. We often use them as fertilizers. Many bacteria are also producers. They're photosynthetic bacteria that produce oxygen for us. And there are nitrogen fixers. Everything on Earth requires some nitrogen, and so these bacteria take nitrogen from a form that we cannot use and change it, convert it into a form that we can use. And so again, they are very important in our world. How do we use them? If you guys ate cheese or yogurt, those all had some kind of bacteria in the process of making them. So we actually do use bacteria prokaryotes quite often in our everyday lives. The last section we're going to talk about, quite short, is about protists. This is a group that is very mixed between different organisms they look very different. We're just going to talk about how we classify them based on their movements. The first, if you've ever heard of an amoeba, this is the first type of movement of protists. Amoebas, they kind of not swim around, but they just kind of move around by moving their cytoplasm into little false feet we call pseudopods. And that's how they can change their shape and actually engulf their food. They move very slowly with these pseudopods because their cytoplasm is moving in different directions, and that's what gives them their irregular shape. We also have the protists that have cilia and flagella. We've talked a little bit about flagellas. They are just little tails, if you think about it that way, tails that help to push them along in the liquid that they are living in. Or there's another form of movement called cilia. These are just little hair-like fibers all around the protist body, and they move really quickly and allow it to just kind of swim through the liquid that they're in. Many of these protists live in water, pond water. If you see kind of dirty-looking water, that's usually where they are. But these cilia, these flagella, help them to move around. Some examples of cilia and flagella, organisms or protists that have cilia are called parameciums, and organisms that use flagella are called euglena, and they look very different from each other, and you should have pictures of those on your screen. So those are just examples of what some protists look like and how they move. The last example is protists that don't actually move on their own. They need something else to move them. This example is malaria. Malaria is a protist. The plasmodium, the organism that causes malaria, is a protist. But you don't see or hear people catching this just from touching something or from breathing it in. It's carried through the mosquito. The mosquito has this protist, and then when it bites you or when it takes the blood, that protist is actually sometimes injected into your blood, and then it grows inside of you. It's somewhat of a parasite, but it is alive, and it's called a protist. It's one of these types that doesn't move on its own, it doesn't fly, it doesn't swim. It goes through a secondary host in its life cycle. That's all for this day's lesson. Again, we talked about the viruses that are not alive, but they require another host to survive. We talked about bacteria and how they can move in different ways, how they're very small. We have some that live in extreme environments, and we have the rod-shaped bacteria, the spherical bacteria, and the squiggly bacteria. And then lastly, we have protists, and they are like your amoebas, your protists that move with little hairs and move with tails, and your malaria protists. So if you have any questions, ask your teacher tomorrow, and I hope that when you have the exercises that you will be able to understand a little bit more about these kingdoms that we are learning about. Have a great day.